We've got a big new patch that fixes a number of issues with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, a sales update revealing some promising sales figures, an interview getting into some details about Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3, and an update on tons of things going on with Final Fantasy XVI. We have a big update for all you Final Fantasy fans out there that you're definitely not gonna want to miss. Be sure to participate in my ongoing giveaway of Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance for your chance at winning another big JRPG releasing later this spring. Details in the description. And without further ado, let's bounce. Alright, so Final Fantasy VII Rebirth finally got its big patch that Square promised back when the game launched last February, and while the patch does clear up a number of issues, the main issues players were having with the game, namely the game's graphics and performance mode, hasn't exactly impressed players. The patch deals with more than just slight graphical upgrades, including tweaks to minigames, quest bugs, and ability adjustments, so if you'd rather not hear the full, extensive list of updates introduced with this latest patch, skip to this timestamp on your screen. Alright, let's cut to the chase. Here is the total list of issues that Square has addressed with this current 1.020 patch. Improved frame rate and overall game stability. Added sharp and soft options to the performance mode setting. Improved the quality of the graphics. Correction of typos and omissions in some lines of text. Fixed a bug that occurred under certain conditions on the map when controlling a character. Fixed an issue where Red 13's abilities, Lunatic High, and Watcher's Spirit could easily be cancelled during battles. Fixed a bug that caused enemies to freeze under certain conditions during battles. Fixed a progress bug that occurred under certain conditions during quests. The camera's inverted setting is now applied to the shooting minigame. Enhanced support while climbing the Ivy at the Mithril Mine location. Finally, added difficulty settings to the customization menus for the Fort Condor and Gears and Gambits minigames. So, for what it's worth, many players have noticed very slight improvements when using the game's new Sharp option under the performance mode setting, most notably in the rendering of fine details in blades of grass, some building textures, and certain particle effects. But even so, much of the game in performance mode still looks rather muddy, especially when compared to the game's graphics mode. Now, as for me, I appreciate the effort Square has taken to do what they can to improve the graphics and performance of performance mode, and I hope this trend continues forward for not just Square, but for other developers to take the criticisms that fans have to heart, as this patch is Square's second attempt at making the graphics and performance match the expectations of the players, and that is something that needs to be celebrated. That said, I still play on performance mode since I prioritize higher frame rates, especially when tackling the harder challenges of the game, but let me know what you think about this patch in the comments. Moving on. We have an updated look into the sales of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. In the previous video, we highlighted a rather jarring omission from Square when it comes to their releases, with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth being the first Final Fantasy release in decades where the company did not disclose the game's sales numbers. We learned in our previous update that Rebirth was underperforming Final Fantasy VII Remake in Japan, where Remake was able to sell 700,000 copies in its first week when compared to Rebirth's 263,000 in its home country, with Rebirth a week later having sales drop 90%. With the PS4 having almost double the install base at the time of Remake's release, it's understandable that the sales were much lower than the PS5 only Rebirth sales, but thanks to worldwide data from Circana, we have a better picture of how well Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is performing against the rest of the games. Bear in mind, this data accounts for sales from December 30th, 2023 through March 2nd, 2024. When considering that Rebirth launched on the final day of February this year, it only had 3 days of data in this posting, yet even so, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth landed in 4th place, under the likes of Helldivers 2, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, and Tekken 8, and sold better than Suicide Squad, Madden 24, and Persona 3 Reload, which was considered the biggest ever launch in the Persona series, having sold over 1 million copies in its first week. Considering that game released on every major platform outside of the Switch, Rebirth's sales data, considering this data only had the game list for 3 days, is very impressive. What makes it even more impressive is that Rebirth actually charts again, all the way down at number 16 with the Final Fantasy VII Remake and Rebirth Twin Pack, beating out Avatar, Frontiers of Pandora, and even Minecraft. Now, obviously, it's very likely that Square is still not happy with these numbers, considering that they announced Final Fantasy XVI's accomplishment of selling 3 million units in a week when that game released last summer, but even so, calling Rebirth a flop couldn't be further from the truth. In a post from Chris Dring of GamesIndustry.biz, he reported that while Final Fantasy VII Rebirth's launch is 23% lower than Final Fantasy VII Remake's launch, that it still sold 4% higher than Final Fantasy XVI. With Final Fantasy XVI having sold over 3 million in its first week worldwide, we now know from this data that Rebirth has, in fact, sold better than the previous Final Fantasy game. Definitely a feat worthy of praise. With the game slated to release on PC in the coming months, or certainly next year, the game will only continue to find more of an audience. Fans were quick to point out the game's flop by only looking at Japanese sales data, but Japan is certainly not an accurate representation of what the Final Fantasy brand is capable of in this current era, as Final Fantasy over the years has created a much more global appeal, while Japanese audiences show a continued interest in Switch and mobile gaming in the present era. That said, it's great to see more of a concrete picture of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth sales and its relative success, even when Square Enix is otherwise uninterested in reporting it. Next, we have a recent interview from IGN to go over, interviewing the game's director, Naoki Hamaguchi, over the game's development and further insight into Remake Part 3. It is here at this part of the video where we will talk about spoilers pertaining to the ending scene, so I will put up a big spoiler warning for those who have yet to finish the story of Rebirth. The ending, while not expressly shown or detailed here, reveals much about Hamaguchi-san and team's development on Rebirth, and ultimately how it sets up Part 3. So skip to this timestamp to avoid this section to get to the other Final Fantasy news. Hamaguchi-san told IGN that work on Rebirth progressed smoothly due to having roughly 80 to 90% of the developers who worked on Remake stay on to make Rebirth, with Hamaguchi-san claiming that the ending of Rebirth was crafted very early on by Kazuhige Nojima, the writer of the FF7 Remake trilogy, to execute his vision to the best of their ability. In regards to internal debate regarding the portrayal of the ending of Rebirth, which the team ultimately decided would punctuate the final act of Disc 1 of the PS1 game involving the untimely fate of a particular character, Hamaguchi-san remarked that Nojima-san's ending did not inspire much internal debate, but instead gave, quote, more of this kind of sense of determination as a team to best convey this based on Nojima-san's scenario, end quote. If you are still here, then likely you have already beaten the game, or you don't mind being spoiled about what happens, but regardless of where you're at with the deviations from the original PS1 game, these new elements being added to the Remake trilogy were absolutely intentional from the developers to create intrigue to hold us all over for the final release in FF7 Remake Part 3. In addition to leading up to Part 3, Hamaguchi-san remarks, HD games take quite a long time to develop. It's not as though we can release the final title the following year or anything like that. Of course, it takes a bit more time, so it is our intent and hopes that there will be many thoughts and conjectures as to what the ending exactly means, and we hope that players will kind of think about this and consider this up to the following title. As to what the following title may have in store for us, Hamaguchi-san drops some hints as to what the final game may tackle next, and signs are pointing towards Rocket Town. So, as for Rocket Town, this was also not a part of Nojima-san's original structure for Rebirth, and considering that how we introduced the character Sid, his introduction was arranged a bit differently this time in the remake, but Nojima-san, Nomura-san, and I are all aligned with the decision to consider this for the next title. So, while Rocket Town may have been MIA in Rebirth, it's definitely super exciting to hear that Rocket Town, along with a more proper introduction to Sid and his past as an aspiring astronaut, may get featured in the final game. The original game saw the party actually venture into space, and Rocket Town was key to that happening, so let's hope that Rocket Town is greatly expanded on in the final part, just like how the very small area of Gungaga in the original game was greatly expanded on in Rebirth. To add to a list of what Hamaguchi-san and crew want to accomplish with Part 3, we mentioned in the previous video in his interview with Gene Park of the Washington Post that he wants the Highwind to be fully utilized in the final game, as some of his greatest accomplishments with Rebirth was his team's handling of the large and open environments. As for what's to come in the story, Hamaguchi-san remarks that while the game's script is still in development, that he does note that there is potential for more additions from the greater Final Fantasy VII universe of characters to make an appearance in Part 3. So while I can't comment on the sort of exact contents of the third title now, of course, whenever we present characters that have originally appeared in a compilation title for Final Fantasy VII, we've seen very positive feedback. Fans are very delighted to see some of the characters from the compilation of Final Fantasy VII titles that they have really loved and enjoyed, so I hope that we can continue to touch on these. Hamaguchi-san adds, "At the time, in terms of the storyline, nothing is set in stone." This whole interview in regards to Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 is fascinating, simply because we have heard from Hamaguchi-san before that much of the script has already been completed, but perhaps he intends to mean these additional characters from the compilation of Final Fantasy titles have not yet been integrated into the storyline. Even so, back in the summer of 2022 when Rebirth was officially unveiled, Tetsuya Nomura posted on Twitter that development on the third game had already begun, and in the same interview with the Washington Post, Hamaguchi-san claimed that while the game was still years off, that much of the work of the game has already been done, thanks in large part to the world construction for the pre-existing areas already being finished from Rebirth. So yeah, that's definitely a lot to take in. I know we will obviously get Rocket Town, or at least some significant character development in Part 3 for Cid and Vincent for that matter, since they were hardly around in Rebirth, along with the Highwind to traverse the world map, and seeing as Remake and Rebirth have introduced different timelines or iterations of the lifestream, depending on how you look at it, that have introduced characters from throughout the many titles of Final Fantasy VII over the years, that it is likely that we are going to see more of these characters show up in the final chapter. Taking on Disc 2 and Disc 3, Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 is going to be absolutely massive, seeing as Rebirth essentially made the rest of Disc 1 be the single largest and most content-rich Final Fantasy game to date outside of the MMO titles. What are you most looking forward to in Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3? I'd love to hear all about your thoughts below. And if you thought that was all the Final Fantasy news you thought we had for this video, think again, because we have some very big and exciting news to share regarding Final Fantasy XVI. Final Fantasy XVI was a big release last summer, and for a title that was initially planned to not include any DLC, here we are almost a year later having one of the DLCs already available and the second DLC right around the corner. That's right, because on April 18th this year, the second DLC, The Rising Tide, will drop, introducing more story, an additional land to explore, and another icon to encounter. Surrounding the tale of the fabled Leviathan icon, players will uncover its history and importance to the world of Valisthea with Clive Rossfield, in the most ambitious DLC that has hit the game to date. And guess what? That's not all. Before the DLC drops, Square has outlined a future patch, Patch 1.30, that was detailed during Square's PAX East panel, that outlines some awesome new additions coming to enhance the existing experience with the following. Return to a quest giver immediately with the new Quick Complete function. Icons updated for important character quests. New skill set feature allows you to save up to 5 unique feat and ability sets. Abilities and accessories adjusted to make easier to use, and new controller type that allows for more customizable button layouts. For those wondering if The Rising Tide will mark the final DLC to launch for Final Fantasy XVI, well, director Naoki Yoshida in an interview with Game Informer outlines it all with the following. That's a difficult question, Yoshida-san remarks. My honest answer is, I don't know at the moment, but at the same time, the possibility isn't entirely zero. I don't want to bar out any real possibilities at this time. Yoshida-san disclosed that Final Fantasy XVI was a tremendously expensive game to make, especially with its larger-than-life icon battles, but he doesn't want to completely write off the game as being over for good, even though he feels like his team wants to take on a new challenge. So my honest feeling is that the team does want to take on a new challenge and move on to a different project. Maybe it's a completely new game, perhaps in a completely new form of entertainment. Yoshida-san concludes his statement with, "I feel like ultimately that might be the best route for not just the players, but for us as well too." But again, to reiterate, the possibility of more DLC content for Final Fantasy XVI is not zero. You can glean from that what you will, but man, I loved 16, and as a big fan of both 16 and Rebirth, Final Fantasy fans are eating incredibly well, with the content-packed Rebirth having just launched, and with a sizable addition in the Rising Tide DLC releasing in less than a month for FF16. With that said, are you looking forward to Final Fantasy XVI's upcoming DLC? It's also worth mentioning, especially for those looking forward to playing FF16 on PC, that the game is in its, quote, final optimization stages of development, as mentioned by Yoshida-san in the same interview with Game Informer. We'll just have to wait a little while longer to get the final release for when that version of the game will drop. That was a ton of news for Final Fantasy just there, but please, let me know down below what you think of all this stuff going on with Final Fantasy. It's a great time to be alive as a Final Fantasy fan, with Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 coming out in a few years, and with 16 perhaps wrapping up its story, so be sure to stay tuned to this channel for all updates pertaining to this legendary JRPG franchise and beyond. And definitely check out this video of Persona 6 information if you're interested in that series, as tons of new insider info has been spewing out for that game. Thank you all for your continued support as always, and I will see all you good people real soon in the next one.